To our webinar today on historic structure reports and a steeple assessments overview with Matt Collins and Ellen Angel. Matt Collins is a Maine licensed architect with a practice focusing on historic buildings, downtowns, and campuses. He has directed projects for the University of Maine, Bowdoin, Bates, and Colby Colleges, Historic New England, and the City of Portland. Matt serves as the architect member of the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and sits on the Maine Downtown Center Advisory Committee, which works with Maine communities that participate in the National Main Street Center. He's the architect member and a past chairman of the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and an advisory trustee and past board president of Greater Portland Landmarks. He and his wife Susan live in Freeport in an 1849 shipwright's house located in the Harrisseacock National Register Historic District, which demands and deserves his constant attention. Ellen Angel is co-owner of Artifacts Architects and Engineers. She brings extensive experience in complex project design and management. Ellen began her career in California over 25 years ago with Ron Yao, working on civic recreation and high-end residential projects. She spent many years with Ware Malcolm as a senior associate and principal. She was designer and project manager on diverse and complex corporate, commercial, and industrial facilities. After moving to Maine, Ellen had a small office in Eastport, specializing in custom coastal, residential, healthcare, and historic renovation. She joined Ames AE in 2005 as a senior architect prior to founding the company now called Artifacts in 2010. So welcome to both of our speakers. And I am going to go on mute and turn off my camera. And we're going to hear from Matt.
All right, thank you, Ali. It's a pleasure to be here. I must admit that this is my first presentation via Zoom. I've been to meetings and participated in them, but this will be my first one where I'm actually delivering the program. So I hope you'll bear with me if I'm a little not rusty, but inexperienced. A few words about the phrases historic structures report and building assessment before we get started in the slides. Today's presentation will show you an example of each of those two approaches. They are similar, but they have some very basic differences. But the bottom line is that they will help you, undertaking one and completing one will help you with your management and or stewardship of an historic building if you are responsible for one or more. Historic structures reports is sort of a geeky subject. I'm sorry about that, but it's an academic exercise. The HSR is. It's detailed and thorough and documented. It often results in some really fantastic historic photographs and descriptions, but they generally do not have glamorous before and after shots that you see at the award shows. But the fact is, it's an extremely valuable exercise. HSRs can be really the first step in adopting a disciplined approach to the care of an historic building, usually undertaken by institutional owners of significant historic properties ranging from nonprofit house museums to entire universities and multi-building commercial properties. Although it's not commonly done for private residences, it has been known to be used in cases of an extremely significant property. Basically, an HSR provides documentary, graphic, and physical information about a property's history and existing conditions, discussion of management or owner goals for reuse or reuse of the property, thoughtfully considered arguments for selecting the most appropriate approach treatment prior to starting the work. And that word treatment is important, and we'll come back to that when we get further into the process. It's pretty much really does apply just to HSRs and is one of the things that separates it from a building assessment. It provides guidance for all changes to be made to an historic property from the point of its creation, foundation for stewardship of historic properties, and documentation of the research and investigation that has taken place. The first HSR is thought to have been prepared by the National Park Service early in the 1930s. And since then was used extensively by the National Park Service, primarily their Technical Services Division, which really has sort of formed the background of the development of historic preservation as an architectural and engineering practice. HSRs came into much more common use with the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. With that act came the establishment of the National Register of Historic Places and the introduction of state historic preservation offices in each state. The State Historic Preservation Office staff, among other duties of them, were administer newly created federal and state grant programs aimed at preserving the country's historic buildings, structures, and landscapes. The Park Service encouraged grantees to undertake HSRs as planning and evaluation tools. Since then, HSRs have come to be considered one of the most basic and effective historic preservation planning tools. Having a completed HSR can lead to recognition and funding assistance for significant historic properties. Ellen is going to deal with more description of the building assessment, but in this project, Ellen and I worked together as members of her firm's staff also, and some carefully selected specialty consultants. And this project that I'll show you is currently in its final editing and will soon be finalized or soon be produced. The photo, this is the Academy Hall, called Academy Hall. It's located on the USM campus in Gorham, Maine. The building is really a textbook example of one that can benefit from the preparation of an HSR. So to give you a feel for the HSR process, we'll describe the various parts and steps and components with you. I should indicate that the project was undertaken for the University of Maine system. And our intent and theirs, I think, is to use this as a model that can be applied to several of the other very historic structures that the University of Maine system has, particularly in Gorham and Orono, but on some of the other campuses as well. So with that, Ellie, if you can go to the next slide. HSRs are typically an interdisciplinary project, and ours for the Academy building was no exception. Ellen led her staff at Artifacts in the process and directed the project. Mike Poulin, a member of her staff, contributed his historic preservation expertise to the team. Scott Homer, the structural engineer. Jason Bolio of Colby Company was a mechanical engineer. We also had Patrick Guthrie, who's a building forensics expert, and then Kyla Magnuson for project estimating. There's one team member that we don't have that we unfortunately couldn't have on board just because of some budgetary constraints, was a sustainability and green design consultant. We felt that was a very important aspect of the project, and it's one we hope that we'll be able to visit more in more detail later on. Next slide. This slide shows a team role matrix we put together for the owner. I won't go through it in detail, but I put it up there just to show you that it really is a fairly complex scope of work involving, in this case, probably more than 10 people on the project team. Next slide. We worked very closely with, I mentioned State Historic Preservation Office before. We worked very closely with Kirk Money and the staff at the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. And we also worked with Earl Shuttleworth, who played a part in reviewing our work and also leading to us to a couple of very important aspects in the history of the building. And I won't go through, I think most of you are familiar with the commission and know what its work is, so I won't read down the list, so if we can have the next slide. A fairly important aspect of the project was the regulatory environment in which the building exists. And of course, that means building codes. Mike Poulin, whom I mentioned also at Artifacts, was our code consultant and provided a pretty thorough code evaluation of the building based on its current use, which is intended to be its future use as well. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the history of the building. Next slide. I'll spend a few minutes on the history of the building because that's really part of the fun, or a big part of the fun of it. The town, and it's intertwined with the history of Gorham, of course. In those early colonial days, without public schools, the local academy could be the complete complete education of the local youngsters, or it might be just a part of it. But Gorham, the first Euro-American settlers arrived in Gorham in 1736. It was definitely a frontier town. They had their share of conflicts in the early days with Native Americans in the surrounding areas, but those tended to be behind the local settlers, the European American settlers, when it was granted a township in 1764 by the state of Massachusetts, of which, of course, Maine was a part. The academy itself was founded, the institution itself was founded in 1803. They had a grant from the state of Massachusetts that they had land to sell off to raise money to create the academy, and they were quite successful at it. 3 years from that time, they were completed construction of the building in 1806. First students were welcomed into the academy in September of that year. In 1806, it was about 20 male students. By 1807, they had an equal number of female students. So it was an early pioneer in co-ed education. They also accepted boys under 10 starting in 1813. So a very wide range of students under one roof. The academy grew quite to the point where they had 200 and some students in the mid to the late 1800s. They eventually added a seminary, which was the girls' school, and had separate schools, but then fire destroyed the girls' seminary building, and then so they ended up back in the same building. As I said, they expanded from 1835 and really did quite well until the coming into being of public schools, and that occurred in Gorham around 1875 to 77. At that point, the academy came on hard times and was looking into various ways to survive. And in the course of that investigation, they started negotiations with the Maine higher education community, and in 1878 became really an official part of the early predecessors of the University of Southern Maine. They rented or leased the building until 1909, when they actually took out a long-term lease from the state. In 1909 was for 999 years, and the lease payment was $1 a year. And that lease continues in place, and it is the building is still owned by the trustees of Gorham Academy, but for all intents and purposes, it's a University of Maine building and is maintained as part of facilities management duties at USM. When the building was put into use by the university, what was the predecessor university system, it served multiple uses until around 1916, when the entire structure was converted for use as an industrial arts program. It seems sort of incongruous to think of such an elegant, simple building being used, having lathes, wood lathes and presses and saws and all of that stuff in it, but it apparently filled the bill because it stayed in that use until 1966, when a new building was constructed on the Gorham campus, and the Academy building came to be one of the buildings housing the art department of USM. And that is the use that it continues to this day, and it is the use that is in the current or just fairly recently completed University of Southern Maine master plan. The only really significant changes to the building occurred in 2013, when ADA bathrooms were added and some other changes were made. It's really quite amazing and unique that a major early 19th century academic building constructed entirely of wood has survived at all. Many of these academies, along with churches, which were quite similar in design and construction, ended up succumbing to fire. But this one has never had that, was subjected to that, and is in really quite good condition for its age. Continuing along the historical vein, one thing we discovered that was quite interesting was that in 1909, in preparation for the building going into that long-term lease, part of the lease states that the university has to maintain the building in its historic, really in so many words, in its historic grandeur. It was very specific in saying that the care and maintenance had to be directed at maintaining it as the trustees knew it and had known it through its entire life. It even says that if the building were to be destroyed by fire, that the building would have to be reconstructed to basically duplicate its original look. So that was an early example of preservation thinking before it was really commonplace in this use. And so for those renovations, the trustees hired the office of John Calvin Stevens to undertake the renovation. And the only drawings we have, or we were able to uncover, of the Academy building in it near to its original form were the drawings prepared by the Stevens office. And you see one of those here in the lower right. Next slide. So the bulk of in addition to the historical analysis, which was quite a lengthy part of the project, and typically would be for a building of the significance that might justify an HSR. The other, of course, is existing conditions. And we did a very thorough documentation evaluation of those conditions. And as I said, in reality, we found the building to be in quite good condition. This is a couple of images of the basement. You can see in the floor plan in the lower left, a single space with a bulkhead to the exterior. Nothing, just, the examples of the heavy timber framing in quite good condition. Foundation walls of granite rubble faced with granite slabs on the exterior and brick on the interior. Very little water damage. There was some evidence of some movement on one or two of the walls, but nothing out of the ordinary. Next slide. And here you see some details of the foundation. One of the fun parts of HSRs usually is getting to draw up fairly accurate base drawings. Rarely do they exist, particularly for a building of this vintage and this sort of rural vernacular federal style building. But of course, as you can see here, there have been modern systems introduced into the building. But on the upper right, you see the granite slabs that provide the exterior face of the foundation. Just some grouting and mortaring problems there to speak of. Nothing terribly significant. Next slide. At the interior, this building, when we get to the exterior, I'll talk a little bit more about its significance and its importance. But the exterior is quite, for a town of Gorham's size and sort of the frontier nature of it, is quite a grand exterior. But the interior was very plain, and to the extent that we could do interior research, we really didn't find any. We were not able to do color analyses and decorative finishing analyses. So we don't know, for example, if the stair hall was originally decorated with paint or gilding or anything of that sort. But still, there are a few flourishes, like the decorative trim underneath the stair treads, and the stairway would have been the only space of any decorative interest. You see the floor plan there. In the original plan, there were only two spaces. The little office down in the lower right-hand corner was constructed, may not even been constructed originally, but was built within a year or two. And then the rest of it was just an open space with the stairway in the corner. And there was a two booth privy on the back of the building, which would be the upper left. That it's no longer existent, but we know it was there until well into the 1890s, and probably later than that. You see Some of the ways the art department has made very good use of the building. They like it a lot. It's bright, the ceilings are high, the finishes are durable. They have been changed somewhat, but nothing that isn't reversible. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the word reversible as it applies to historic preservation. Pretty much everything that's been done is reversible. It's quite a flexible space for them, you know, big space with 3 columns in it, 2 columns in the major studio space. So quite easy to use. And if we can go to the second floor, next slide. Second floor is even better flexibility wise because the massive trusses that hold up the roof and the ceiling made columns unnecessary at the second floor. So it's a wide open space. The stairway was enclosed probably around 1822, and the office remains there. And then in the more recent past, another office was added to the, would be the southwest corner. Again, you can see what seems to be a comfortable living arrangements for a couple of faculty members and great studio space for the students. Next slide. So the structure, I'm not going to get into too much of that because I'm not the expert, but it was quite heavy wood construction. You can see the basic outlines of it here. In pretty good shape. The usual problem with these kinds of structures, which were built with quite large cross sections of heavy timber, as you can see in the photo in the upper right. But the problem is, of course, the section modulus of them, in other words, their proportions of width to height, was not very conducive to overall strength. So in the case of this building, there's some 12 by 12s, which sound like they ought to really be able to support a huge load, but in fact, because they're square instead of rectangular and they don't have enough strength in tension on the underside, they quite often need reinforcement if they need to be meant to brought up to current codes. In this case, because we are not changing the use of the building, and we're not, you'll see when we get into recommendations, we're not proposing huge changes. Will probably not be required to do much in the way of reinforcement. Here's a picture. Go ahead, Ellen.
Yeah, this was a really interesting structure. It's basically a timber frame. So there are columns within the walls. They kind of jut into the space a few inches, probably jutted in a few more inches originally, but there's been some material put on the walls to use for tacking and whatever. But in actuality, the exterior walls almost hang from the structure. So it's almost a it's very, for us it was unique in that construction, and it took us a while to figure out what was going on because our every time we went around trying to measure it, we couldn't figure out why we were getting these different measurements. And when we did some deeper research, we discovered that there was a time when this kind of construction was a more typical construction method. So it was very interesting. The whole frame was put up, and then the walls were sort of applied to the outside of it.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. Next one. Thank you. HVAC and electrical, mechanical, I won't spend much time on that. It's basically all new systems, reasonably well introduced into the building in terms of impact on on character defining features. I certainly can't say it's terribly efficient in the overall scheme of things, but they have managed to keep the building serviceable. It should have some energy retrofitting. There are things that can be done without damaging character defining features that will be part of some of the future projects. Next slide. So I mentioned the exterior Earl Shuttleworth feels this is probably one of the best, if not the best, early 19th century wood academic buildings in Maine and possibly even in New England. And you can see it has some really beautiful federal style details in the portico and pediment, and it really speaks to the instructions from the Board of Trustees to the local builder who erected it, that they wanted a building that would impart some elegance and some importance to education in the growth of and prosperity of their town. So I think it definitely accomplishes that. And of course, its siting way up on the top of the hill really speaks to that sort of the chapel on the hill, or the institution of higher learning on the hill. In terms of conditions, it's in pretty good shape. The east elevation with the portico in places where the various components come together. There has been a fair amount of water damage, water coming down from the gable roof of the pediment, things of that sort, and then sort of filtering its way down. And you can see a little bit of examples. These are the coins on the side of the building. But, you know, its exterior treatment is going to be very, very typical and very much a preservation and restoration project. I'll get into that as we segue into the question of treatment. So next slide, please. I mentioned the lease agreement required the university to maintain the building. Part of the HSR, very important part, is to establish an appropriate treatment for the building. And that gets into the whole National Register, National Park Service background of an HSR. There are 4 treatments. I'm sure all of you probably know what they are: preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And in an HSR, you typically want to assign one of those 4 treatments to the building, and then that sets the tone for any work that you propose to do. In our case, in the exterior, preservation is really the appropriate treatment because, as I said, what's there is in pretty good shape. There will be some restoration, particularly at the pediment and the portico on that east elevation, but primarily it's preservation. The interior, it's going to be rehabilitation because there hasn't been much change. The spaces are so flexible that it makes it an easy building to reuse without having, as long as the proposed treatment can make use of that flexibility. In other words, you wouldn't want to put anything in here that called for 30 private offices, but art studios, dance studios, a nice meeting hall, something of that sort would be readily adaptable to this building. So rehabilitation would allow you to do things like put in the restrooms, put on a second means of egress from the second floor, that sort of thing, without doing damage to the building's character or appearance. I mentioned those already, so let's go on to next slide. I mentioned those. So these are just descriptions of the Secretary's standards for preservation, restoration, and then the current slide shows the Secretary's standards for rehabilitation. As I mentioned, use and occupancy must be similar. Historic character will be retained. You don't want to put on any fake stuff. That's what basically that next one is. Distinctive materials or construction techniques will be preserved and features will be repaired rather than replaced. Next slide. Some more of these, the standards: chemical or physical treatments will be non-damaging, which means no sandblasting, no harsh chemicals. Archaeological resources will be protected. We did not get into archaeology, but given the extensive residency in the area of Native American populations, it's entirely possible there might be something on that hill. And the reversibility, I think I mentioned that already. Next. So based on the existing emissions analysis and the consideration of the different treatments and choosing preservation on the exterior, rehabilitation on the interior, and thus if we had to choose one to apply to it, it would be rehabilitation because the preservation can fall under that. We were asked to make recommendations on projects to bring the building up to its original conditions, really. And then to make the interior, allow the interior to continue to function in its current use. So we developed several projects. The desire was, those of you familiar with the funding issues at the university system will understand that they hoped that we could put our recommendations in terms of several small scale projects, and that could be budgeted over a period of years based on priorities we helped them establish. And so that's the direction that we took. So I'll describe the projects a little bit. Project one, next, yes. Next slide, please. Project one looks at some of the issues that I mentioned, and the red rectangle around the little elevation lower right-hand corner shows this is the east elevation, and this will be the first project. This is the most imminent, these have the most imminent repair issues. In fact, the column on the right-hand end of the portico when we first visited the building was lying on the ground. And so they recognize that the restoring that front elevation is, and not to mention it puts a good front on the project, very prominent location, highly visible, showing that they are being good stewards of the building, and also hoping that they'll get some fundraising help. Next slide. Some more down at the front porch level. The front porch deck is some very large granite slabs. As near as we can tell, there's not a whole lot of structure under them, but we were not really able to get access to what's under there as part of the project. But rotting at the bases, the slabs moving around, the step threads needing some work. So that's project one. Next slide. Project 1A involves going up and getting into the pediment and the balustrade and the roof of the portico with gable face and details and flashing trim, of course, roofing, porch railings, the soffit, building siding, and painting above the second floor. So a fairly extensive project, but a really worthwhile one. Next slide. And you'll see the cost estimate there of $93,000. A very important part of the project and typically of an HSR is to do some cost estimating once you've developed your recommendations for scopes of work. We hired a cost estimator and had a very thorough process applied to these projects, and we're pretty comfortable that they're realistic. And the client, the owner, was quite pleased with the scope and the size of the various projects. Next slide. So then the part, project 1B for the lower part, the steps and everything, next slide, worked out to be just about the same number. So about $180,000 to do the entire facade. Next slide. Then we continued on the exterior for the next project, siding restoration. Much of the siding was in, I'd say fair to good would be the best condition that we found. There is quite a bit of it that may need to be replaced. We'd like to leave as much original up as we possibly can. You see the sort of feathered joints of the clapboards, the horizontal joints, which when they were new and painted, you couldn't even see any joints in the clapboards. So we'd like to kind of get back to that as a character defining feature. Next slide. And so for exterior siding, we're looking at about another $85,000. Next slide. Some work on the foundations. I mentioned some of the issues we had there. The left photograph shows the wall, one wall that was leaning in. A fairly significant amount, but again, not anything we would not have expected. Next slide. So the costs there are about $36,000. Next slide. And then going up to the top of the building, the roof and the cupola. We were not able to evaluate that as much as we would have liked, because at the time we were actually using condition analysis, the snow, the roof and everything was covered with much more snow and ice than you see there. But we were pretty sure we have a pretty good scope of work on that. Next slide. And that comes out to be, say, $50,000. That's really the end of the preservation-oriented work and restoration-oriented work. Going to the next slide shows moving into something probably further out, well, certainly after the other projects are finished, is in the place of where the Privy Tower used to be. We're proposing to put a stair tower and elevator. There is no elevator now, and second means of egress is a fire escape on that back side of the building. So this we would see as a fairly important project to be put in the budget down the road a little ways. Next slide. And that project would be a little over $400,000. And then one more project. I mentioned that the stairway would appear to be the only place where there was really much in the way of potential for decorative work in the past. And so we're suggesting as really wanting to have an interior project that would allow us to restore a space back to the original finishes. And so we chose that front stairwell. One thing I didn't mention was a major part of the 1909 renovation work was that a pressed metal ceiling was installed in almost the entire first and second floors. That is still in place above a suspended acoustic ceiling. And at some point, and it's certainly restorable, you can restore that material fairly easily. There is new material available, but that's kind of a flourish as opposed to these other projects. But the interior stairwell to kind of get it back to its original condition, next slide, would be about $80,000. So that's the scope of our explanation of what an HSR is. I think it's a fairly typical one, and hopefully it will be the first of several that will be done on the university campuses, and hopefully it has explained the concept and made doing one might be a help for you in the buildings you're taking care of.
Great, thanks, Mac. Any questions from the audience at this point before we turn it over to Ellen? You could also wait till the very end if you choose, but if you have a question, you could unmute yourself and ask it now. So we'll give you like 30 seconds.
I have a question.
Excellent.
It has nothing to do with the wonderful building, but I noticed that there seem to be the two boilers that are part of that. I was wondering, they look like Boderas boilers, and I was wondering about maintaining them, and if you could maybe send me the information about who you have maintaining your Boderas boilers, if that's a good way to be going at this point. So,
you want to answer that, Ellen?
Sure. You know, honestly, the maintenance of all of that is part of the university facilities department. And
okay.
they really are responsible. They have a whole program for all of their facilities on all of their campuses. We don't get much involved with it. Typically when we go into another project, you know, it's one of the first things we check is the maintenance tag on the boiler to see who maintained it and when. But in this case, because it's a university property, they maintain it and keep all of those records. So
all right,
be very helpful. Sorry. But the university may be able to help you. I mean, the facilities department there is really knowledgeable and helpful. So you could try them.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right, well, Ellen, I think we're going to turn it over to you. I'm going to stop my share so that you can start your share.
All right, let's see. Hang on a second and we'll see if we can, how we're going to do this. Oh, is that the one I want? Nope, I want this one. Okay, and I'm sure I can figure this out anytime soon. Where are we? Okay, let's see if I can get this up. All right, so what I wanted to kind of discuss is the difference between an HSR and an HSA. And an HSR, as Malcolm described, a historic structures report, is really an academic exercise, a critically important one that spends a lot of time on the historicity of the building and is is probably where your character defining features would be delineated and spends a lot of time with that aspect of the structure. The historic structures assessment is something that many owners of historic structures are asked to do in order to qualify for certain grants and loans. And sometimes there's, we get requests for a historic structures report, and then when we delve into it, we find out that really what's needed is an assessment. And so an assessment is basically a picture in time of what the condition of the building is at that moment, right? So I'm just gonna run through one that we did a long time ago, because now we do a lot of these steeple assessments for steeple funding. And oftentimes, I'm trying to figure out how I can get this a little smaller, not completely, there. Okay, so lots of times what happens is that we get called in because there's a problem. Someone notices, in this case, there's a leak, right? There's a very major leak, and they say, well, oh no, we have to get this fixed. Oh, we need money to get this fixed. And they apply for a grant, and they're told, well, you have to have someone assess the full picture of why the problem is. So that was the case with this lovely church. And so the first thing we do with that is we go out and we take pictures, right? We document, just like Mac is talking about what we did with the Academy Hall. We document the existing conditions. So we take a lot of pictures. We often take 500 to 800 pictures. In fact, part of the time is spent just cataloging the pictures so that we have a record going forward of what the conditions are. And so, we see lots of little conditions, things with roofing issues, siding repair issues, the steeple sloping one way or the other. Let's see. Since I didn't set this up as a slideshow, it's a little harder. We go in and do also interior photos. So we take interior photos of, every aspect of it. And again, hundreds.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Ellen. We're still seeing the exterior of the building. I'm not sure.
Oh, it's not, it didn't go to the next slide.
It's not progressing, no.
Okay, let's see here. Let's go back to here.
I think you might be sharing that photo gallery page rather than maybe your screen. You might have better luck if you share the screen.
You may want to unshare your
screen. Yeah, it's not right. It's not, okay.
Yeah.
And then reshare with each time you change the photo.
Let's see if we can do this. There we go. Exterior. That might work better.
Yep. Now we can see that. That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So, so this is, the interior, and it was a really lovely, it has lots of lovely details in it. And again, typically nowadays, or in the past few years, someone from Maine Preservation, right, the private group, has come out and done pre-assessments before we were contacted to do these assessments. And so a lot of the historic documentation was done. Or if these buildings are on the National Register already, they typically have the character defining features listed, although a lot of the early ones that were put on really early don't. So we do have to note what those are. Okay, well, let's get, so we create floor plans, which is what we did at Academy Hall. This is an example of this one. It's very simple. It's not, you know, we don't do a real architectural set of drawings as much as just to make sure we have the conditions all described. We take photographs and rectify the photographs and describe the elements so that we can, in this case, show things that are the character defining features. And this, I mean, I just fell in love with this church because it's so, it's so lovely, and it has so many nice wood features. I mean, everything from the, you know, from the decorative shingling, you know, the change in shingling, and siding from the different levels to the kind of applied stick work and the decorations on the barge boards, and everything was just lovely. So we tried to document that in a way that is simple for everyone to see. Let's see, go to the next one. And then, you know, this was one of the features that was really unique to this church, was I had never seen stained glass windows sort of in this pattern. It was just a simple block work stained glass. Then we, in this case, we don't always do this, but we created a 3D model because the problem was with this corner of the steeple, and we were trying to understand how the steeple worked and how that condition worked. So kind of fly around this, and really it was right here. that was the key issue, was right there, and how the water was directed and where it was directed. So we see this a lot, where between the steeple and the roof, the water gets directed right in this little corner right here, and we lose a lot of steeples in that situation. And it's not really an easy fix. It's not necessarily an attractive fix. Oftentimes we have to put a downspout there. But it does fix the issue. And then this is a site plan of the project. So the difference between, and this is, again, these are where the problems are. So we get up real close and you can see, here we are at the roof itself. It's got real problems. Here's where the water comes in. Here's why it comes in. We define those problems. So an HSA, a historic structures assessment, and I'm gonna close this off now and put it just back to you guys. But it's the key difference is, I think, scope. The historic structures report is really a historic document that documents for all time the history of that building. A historic structures assessment is a document, a snapshot of an instant in time. And it includes a lot of the same things as the HSR, but a lot of things it doesn't include. So.
Great. Thanks, Ellen. Any questions from the audience from either of our speakers? That was really illuminating. I hope folks found this useful, because I did, for sure. They're pretty quiet. They're still with us, but they're quiet. So you guys have crushed it. So let me pull up, while they're thinking about maybe questions they might have, I'll let everyone know that our next event is going to be in December. Coming up on December 9th, and we're going to take a look at historic preservation easements, give you an introduction of what they're all about and how Maine Preservation works with preservation easements to protect significant structures in perpetuity here in Maine. So if you're interested in that for yourself, for your friends, for your neighbors, or just for fun, feel free to register for that one, because we'll look forward to seeing you then. Any questions? Still no questions? So I'll just close out then and say thank you all for attending today. If you enjoyed today's program or any of our programs that we've been offering over the past months, which we are planning on continuing to do in 2021, we have a really exciting slate of programming that's going to be coming up next year that I'm tickled about. I'm pleased to announce that in February, Michael Gobelbane from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission will be joining us to give us an introduction to the National Register and how that process works here in Maine and what the state's priorities are in terms of register listings. That's going to be a fun session, and that's coming up on February 10th. But if you're enjoying any of these programs, we'd love your support to help us keep going in our mission and sharing information like this with you all. Any questions? Well, they're still here, but they're quiet. So thank you everyone for attending. Mac and Ellen, I don't know if you have any closing comments. Otherwise, we'll adjourn for the afternoon and give everyone their evening back.
Thank you very much.
Oh, Mac, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Just thank you all for attending. Definitely appreciate your attention. If you have any other questions, we're available to answer them.
Okay, Mac, you're off mute now.
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. And hopefully those of you who are responsible for buildings, quality historic buildings, significant buildings, may know a little bit more about how to proceed with your planning.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone, have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you,
Thank
have
you
a good
so much.
Thanks Ellen and Mac, we really appreciate it.
You.
Take care everybody.